It was 2 years of serious progress for Port Vale under Darrell Clarke. They won promotion from League Two at Wembley in 2022, and they were well on their way to a safe lower mid-table finish. But after a tricky run of form, one or two disagreements between Darrell Clarke and the owners, the Shanahans, meant that Clarke departed a little bit acrimoniously, and now Port Vale, it's a difficult time for them, and I'm really interested to discuss that because how much Port Vale almost feeling a little bit back to square one now Darrell Clarke has gone, or can Andy Crosby, who's been named his permanent replacement, having been assistant to Darrell Clarke, continue that feeling of progression and make sure that those 2 years, the work done in that time hasn't been undermined. Well, to discuss where Port Vale are right now and how they can move forward, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the Valiants here, Scott Challinor. Scott, thanks for joining us. How are you, mate?
Yeah, good game yourself.
Yeah, great to have you on the show, mate. Really appreciate your time. So thanks for joining us. Obviously, before we get started, I'm covering all 72 clubs across the EFL between mid-June and mid-July. So we're also available on YouTube and on Spotify. So if you're watching this on either of those platforms, do give us a subscribe because it helps us out a lot, and check out the other videos once you're done with this one. Scott, how do you reflect on, I suppose, mainly the last 2 years, but also, I suppose, the decision to then part company with Darrell Clarke?
Well, a lot can happen in 2 years, can't it? I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that trip to Wembley because it only feels like just yesterday. I mean, it was just over a year ago now, and obviously we're in a whole different world then, and a lot's changed since. And I think at the time I was quite emotive about the dismissal of Clarke because it did feel as if he'd been blindsided to an extent by the owners, and it was almost as if a substandard January in the transfer window was almost being pinned on him, and results were being blamed as the reason for the dismissal. And I think it's become clear since then that there's a lot that was going on behind the scenes that shouldn't be in the public eye, and that's probably why there was a little bit of discord going on. And so it seems as if the decision to dispense with Clarke was very much sort of a personal decision as well as a professional one. So I think on reflection, perhaps the Shanahans have done the right thing by choosing to part company. Of course, the question then was who would replace him. They went with Andy Crosby, chose the continuity option. Mixed response within the fan base, but I think since then we've had a positive transfer window so far. Obviously, there'll be the jury will be out on that, depending on how we sort of we go getting into the season in terms of our early form. But in terms of what's coming through the revolving door at the minute, it seems pretty promising. So I'm nervously optimistic for the season ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to look too much into the past with Darrell Clarke because I understand that Vale fans want to be in the mindset of getting excited for the new season, and I totally appreciate that. And at the same time, I think it's quite interesting for me to explore it for a moment, which is, I suppose, one of the appealing things about Darrell Clarke and one of the reasons why he was loved by the supporters was because I see him as such an instinctive figure who will kind of just see when he thinks something, he'll just say it. He's not very measured. I don't think he's someone who's going to toe a particularly political line. I think he's going to call things as he sees them. And I think that's what's kind of endeared him, especially to people in that part of the country who are quite similar to that, I suppose, in a way. So I suppose are we looking at probably two sides of the same coin, where that can be a real strength in a way that he connects with people, but also it can be a weakness in terms of maintaining relationships upstairs?
Yeah, I think what you see is what you get with Darrell Clarke, isn't it? I mean, he's very much take him at face value. He's very much an emotional guy as well, says things how they are. And I think the fans really do resonate with that. I think he was very forthright when he said sort of in that first season where he came in, where, you know, it was the behind closed door season. We were struggling for form. I think we won something like 2 in 23. A clear out was needed. And he was very brutally honest about that and came out in the public domain and basically said, I can't wait to get rid of the deadwood and build a squad of my own. So I think the fans really identified with that and really took to him quite well. And so that's kind of the positive side of that kind of management. But I suppose, as you say, there is a negative side to that. And when you are as emotional a man as Darrell Clarke is, and you do often sort of say things and then reflect on them later, I mean, it does have its issues. And I think maybe you did start to see a little bit of that towards the end of his tenure at Port Vale. I mean, he was very, very forthright in what he was saying about sort of the January transfer business. Didn't sort of say it in the terms as if he was thrown under the bus or anything like that, but I think he was very, very upfront about the fact that, January wasn't good enough. This is why we are where we are. And maybe behind the scenes, perhaps the hierarchy at the club didn't particularly like that. So I thought that may have been something that perhaps fed into the decision to let him go. But there's a lot to it from certainly from what I can gather that kind of feeds into that decision as well.
So the other decision, Scott, was the one to replace Darrell Clarke with Andy Crosby. I can completely understand how, given it's been a hugely successful 2 years on balance, I would say for Port Vale, you would go for the continuity option of Andy Crosby, somebody who's been part of that. On the other hand, I look at lots of other managers in this league who have got promotions on their CV or who have proven themselves to deliver against the odds of the number one. Or I look at coaches who have got a really high reputation and are hugely talented. I struggle to see perhaps what Andy Crosby's what you'd look at Andy Crosby and say that's his main selling point, and that's kind of the sort of reservation I have about that.
And I think a lot of the fans would agree with that, Gabe. And the reason I say that is because, fair enough, he's got a lot of experience. He's been an assistant manager to Nigel Atkins at a higher level than this. And so he probably has promotions on his CV in the back room, but he's never been a manager before. You could argue that his first sort of taste of first-time management in the promotion season from League Two, where he did have to stand in for Clarke during his bereavement leave, you could argue there was a lot of success to that, and that's probably what sort of fed into proving his managerial credentials to the Port Vale board. But the thing that is really difficult to sell to fans is, well, who's going to want to come and play for Andy Crosby? Is there going to be that pulling factor? Are we going to be able to bring players into the club that are going to take us forward at this level? And I guess from what's been going on so far during this transfer window, you could potentially argue that there is some sort of pulling factor there, because I'm quite impressed with what we've managed to pull off so far in terms of proven League One players at this level, bringing in players as well, maybe from the league below, who look like they can maybe kick on. So I guess we'll see. I guess the jury's out on that one, but in terms of being able to attract, I think we're doing much better than we were able to do last summer. But perhaps the fact that, we've survived a season in League One and there is that sort of air of, we're almost established at this level now and can maybe look to push on to the next level. Maybe there is that's feeding into some players' minds as well when we're sort of going out and looking for potential signings.
Sure, and one person who's involved with that recruitment process is David Flitcroft. I don't want to underestimate by any means at all the role that David Flitcroft has had in what Port Vale have achieved over the last couple of seasons and in terms of a positive window. But I do have one or two reservations about it as well, because one of the reasons that we used for the poor recruitment last summer was the Robbie Williams concert, which for me was a bit of a red flag, because to me, I see that as an excuse. I think the idea that a professional football club can't simultaneously arrange a concert and be doing the due diligence required to recruit the right players, that feels like a bit of a cop-out to me. And I do wonder if, that sort of excuse is being used. What sort of message does that send out? So I've got some reservations there, but clearly some lessons have been learned, because the recruitment has been strong this summer.
Yeah, and I think the club are desperate to prove a point on that, because there was a lot of noise about exactly that issue, certainly towards the end of this season and in the early part of the summer as well. And it kind of dates back not just to last summer, but also the January that we had as well. I mean, we did a lot of our business late in both windows, and people were starting to actually ask the question, well, we supposedly got David Flitcroft behind the scenes in this huge recruitment team at his disposal, who was supposed to be looking for players so the manager can concentrate on managing. But, we're X amount of weeks into the window and we still not sign any players. So what is it that they're doing for so long? Is it the fact that, they're lining up 5 or 6 targets, they're all being poached by top 6 clubs and we just can't compete on wages? Is it the potentially that they're not doing their job properly? So I think there were a lot of things that sort of fed into sort of the anxiety within the fan base over periods of time last season. And I think that there's been a much more considered approach to that now. You can certainly see a difference in the profile of player that we're signing, because I think certainly at the start of the summer, when Crosby was appointed, he did come out in the media and make very clear that, we were a little bit of a soft touch last season. We lacked sort of height and presence. We conceded a lot of goals.
Especially without Ben Garrity, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And we certainly missed him, because I think probably the last sort of remotely impressive performance I can remember in the last few weeks of the season prior to the crucial win over Bristol Rovers was when we beat MK Dons at home. And that incidentally was the game where Ben Garrity got injured in the second half and we didn't see him again for the rest of the season. And all of a sudden you saw...
Switch away was pretty competitive though, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was a competitive game. And like I said, I think when you have a workhorse like Ben Garrity in midfield, I think you sort of miss what he does. I mean, he's a bit of an enigma, Garrity, because like he's a player where you don't really know what his role is in midfield and you don't necessarily know what he does well. But him being there, ratting around, breaking up play, but also bringing others into play as well. Like, you only notice when he's not there what he actually does on the field.
Is he a 6 or an 8 for you, do you think, Scott?
I think he's more of an 8, but I'd say he's more of a box-to-box 8 than an attacking 8 in a sense. Sure. You could argue that certainly in League Two, where there's a need for less technical players going forward, he was a lot more effective. But I think playing just that little bit deeper in League One is probably where he's best utilised, because you need to be a much more technical player at this level to sort of be effective in behind a forward or in behind a strike partnership. So I think long term, certainly at this level, I mean, sort of the box to box number 8 is probably where I'd see him fitting in.
Okay, well, hopefully he can certainly do that role, because I think he's a crucial player for Port Vale. So too is Nathan Smith. He's a real stalwart for Vale as well. Scott, how important do you think he's going to be, especially in a time of transition where you're having quite a big turnover of players this summer, new manager as well?
Yeah, I think he's certainly grown into the role a lot over the years. I mean, when he was a younger player, certainly in the League Two days, one of the gripes that a lot of fans had with him was that you get what you get with Nathan Smith, commitment, heart on his sleeve, very, very good in his duels, but not necessarily the best ball player, and also sort of found wanting when he kind of has to take on the leadership role. It was almost as if he sort of profited when you had someone like a Leon Legg or a Connor Hall next to him. And then when you put him next to sort of an Aaron Donnelly like last season, there was maybe a little sense that there was a bit of lickiness at the back again. But to be fair to him, he stepped up well. I think he's certainly improving in terms of being sort of a leader at the back. But I think by bringing in sort of kind of more seasoned professionals who've maybe played at a higher level, the likes of Alex Iacovitti, for example, I think that's probably going to help him over the season ahead, because it sort of takes a lot of the pressure on him as being sort of, that senior man at the back.
Yeah, Iacovitti, I did some due diligence on him and he's actually come with some really good reviews. So that must be quite encouraging if he can translate that form from Scotland into League One.
Yeah, it's always a little bit of an enigma when you have a player from Scotland, because the two pyramids are so different. It's hard to kind of directly compare kind of what level they're playing at, because one week he could be playing against sort of a St Johnstone who might be sort of, lower League One, League Two level in England. And then the next week he'll be playing a Celtic or a Rangers, and they're probably sort of higher Championship to lower Prem level. So it's such a different kind of league that he's been playing in Scotland. And so kind of getting into sort of the knit and grit of League One and sort of seeing how he fares at that level, it is going to be interesting, certainly considering that he's not necessarily had a huge run of games in English football. I know he's had a couple of loan spells at the likes of Forest Green, for example, and he's sort of done okay, but didn't really pull up any trees. But I think after getting well over 100 games in the Scottish Premiership under your belt, I mean, you must have a little bit of something about you. And obviously their fans really, really rate him. He's come with rave reviews from their supporters. A few of them were sort of quite perplexed that he sort of made what they called a step down to EFL 1, but hopefully we can prove him wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reviews from Ross County, I've just been able to get it up there. The County Corner, by the way, thanks to them for their response. They said Alex is rated very highly by a lot of County fans. He's developed into an excellent defender over his 3 years. He's a big physical presence. He's also a strong attacking threat from set pieces. He loves the wind up and mind games against opposition strikers. So I'm sure Vale fans are going to like that side. But I think what interests me there, bench, Scott, is the fact that Iacoviti is a real physical presence, because although Nathan Smith is really aggressive, he's not actually that much of a physical. You don't look at Nathan Smith and think, oh God, he's a really imposing presence. Whereas actually, if you get someone like Iacoviti who can bring that element, that could, and him and Smith could make Vale quite a tough defence to prize open.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like I said earlier about Smith. I mean, it's like, I think he's fantastic in terms of his duels and his battling, but he's not necessarily the biggest defender. And so there will always be some strikers that he will lose out against. And when he was playing in the defence, certainly in the second half of last season, that lacked a real presence after the departure of Connor Hall, that really sort of showed in terms of how many goals we were conceding.
Hall was such a miss, Scott, by the way, Scott, wasn't he? Yeah, such a miss.
Yeah, he was. And like, the sad thing about that is, I mean, he wasn't adequately replaced either. I mean, bringing in someone like Aaron Donnelly and putting that much pressure on a young player to kind of step into the shoes of Connor Hall, I mean, it just showed sort of how almost desperate the recruitment last January felt. And the fact that we didn't properly replace him, I mean, it was a huge factor in sort of the slide down the table that we saw over the latter months of the season. But I mean, it's good that the club have identified that as a real sort of weakness point and a real turning point in our season last year. And I think maybe bringing someone like Iacoviti in, who's also kind of a left-sided centre half as well, it's a great sort of my ideal replacement for kind of that sort of Connor Hall role, as we call it.
Yeah, well, hopefully he can be an excellent signing. The other one I really like, Scott, is Connor Ripley, because he's, I think, in 2 of his last 4 seasons at League One level, he's probably been one of the best goalkeepers in the division. He's outstanding with Morecambe last season. Or certainly the best shot stoppers in terms of that side of things. And at Oldham a few years ago as well, Oldham had this really strange season, Scott, in 16-17, where they were one of the lowest scorers at that level in like post-war history or something crazy like that, and they still managed to stay up and finished about 17th. I think they did last year, because they were so good defensively, and they had Connor Ripley in goal, who was a brilliant shot stopper. Since he's gone higher up the pyramid at Middlesbrough and Preston, it hasn't really worked out for him, but I'm pretty confident that at League One level, if you're asking someone to just be a really good shot stopper, I think he's going to do a job for you.
Yeah, and I think that's what we needed. I mean, what the issue with Maidstone last year was a very, very good keeper at League Two level, but he was found wanting a little bit too much in League One, particularly from range. And in terms of shot stopping, he was one of the worst performing keepers in the division. And we needed somebody whose essentially shots to save ratio was very good, but also somebody who was capable of commanding their box. And I suppose what Connor Ripley brings is he brings that side to the game. He's very comfortable claiming crosses. He's obviously a physical presence as well, being around about sort of 6'3", 6'4", I think he is. And he's a very good shot stopper as well. And I think what that will do is it will only make that defensive 3 in front of him better, because you've got that trust in your goalkeeper. And I think...
And you're also, just sorry if you don't mind me jumping in on that, Scott, you're also not, as a Vale fan, just going to be terrified every time a ball goes into the box, because I imagine it felt quite a few times in the second half of last season, like, oh God, every time a cross goes in, you're almost on tenterhooks. Whereas if you've got a goalkeeper like Connor Ripley, you've also got Nathan Smith, and you've got Alex Iacoviti, it's like you're not necessarily going to be on edge every time the ball goes in there.
Yeah, and what I found quite bizarre last season as well at times is when balls went into the box, I thought I was watching Dracula. Goalkeeper scared of crosses. It's just Stone wasn't coming and claiming them. Yeah, he wasn't coming and claiming them. Quite often he was looking to sort of make punch clearances. And then I suppose Jack Stevens, who we had on loan from Oxford, I mean, even though he was a little bit more of an established keeper at League One level, I think part of the issue with him was, again, he was sort of found wanting with shots from distance. And I know that in the reviews that he had when he first came to the club from Oxford fans, they said, yeah, good shot stopper, but that was a lingering issue with him. And we did come unstuck a lot of times with both goalkeepers from distant shots last season. So I'm hoping that finally we're sort of over that particular problem. And we haven't just, of course, brought Ripley in, but we've also brought in quite capable backup in Jason Leutweiler as well. So, like, I think an experienced shot stopper in reserve was really, really important, just in the off chance anything does happen to Ripley during the campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully he's good for all 46 league games, so that would be great, wouldn't it? I would say that from Port Vale's recruitment so far, there's four signings that I'm really hot on. We've talked about a couple of them, Iacovitti and Connor Ripley. Another one would be Connor Grant, who you've signed from Plymouth Argyle, and also Mitch Clarke, who Vale fans are familiar with because he was absolutely loved down in Burslem in his previous stints with the club. He's obviously a familiar face, and he's just an all-action full wing back. He's versatile as well, but he can do a bit of everything, which I think is going to be helpful.
Yeah, because it seems as if the wing back system is going to be here to stay under Andy Crosby, and that shows in the recruitment as well. We're bringing in wing backs as opposed to attacking wingers. So I think, like I say, Clarke and Grant are absolutely perfect for that system. Mitch, I mean, we know what we're getting with Mitch, with him having been here 3 times before. I mean, he's a fantastic attacking fullback, really, really good defensively as well. And even though he's maybe a little bit more diminutive in stature, I mean, he is quite strong for his size, but we're not going to necessarily need, obviously, the height so much with him playing that position, because that's going to be down to that defensive 3 behind him. So I think just giving him the free rein to essentially come up and down the flank is going to be really, really good for us. We know he's got a good delivery on him. We know he likes coming inside and having shots at goal as well. So he's an absolutely ideal player for the system, knows the club really well, and I think it's a signing that went down really, really well. In terms of Connor Grant, again, fantastic player. Somebody else who's kind of got the experience of a promotion under his belt. He's been in an outstanding environment at Plymouth as well, and should bring some of that into the camp as well. But also, I mean, he's a set piece specialist, and I think that was really, really important from our perspective as well, because with players like Tom Conlon, who are usually sort of the specialists in that area, lacking form at times last season, and perhaps even Conlon could be on his way out of the club this summer. We needed to be bringing in players who were capable of, those deliveries, not just obviously from open play, but also from set piece situations as well. And Grant obviously brings a little bit of that to the table as well.
Yeah, for sure. I always felt though with Connor Grant, when he's played left wing back for Plymouth Argyle, he's not someone that's particularly explosive, that's going to attack the flank. His main strength is that technical ability that you've sort of illustrated with the set piece element. But also I think that means that he's kind of going to be at his best when he's got 1 or 2 players to combine with on the flank. So I'm just wondering if we can kind of visualize that, Scott. Whether we're thinking Alex Iacovitti can make some overlapping runs from left centre back, because I think he's left-footed, and then whether you're going to get a midfielder like a Ben Garrity that could run into the flank. I don't know if you've got anyone left-footed in midfield that will be able to overload the flank, or how that's going to work.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of how we overload on that particular side, but it is something that we are going to need to do. I think just sort of based on how we tended to line up under Darrell Clarke when Connor Hall was in the side, he was very, very aggressive and did often make those forward runs. I always kind of joke with everybody that I go and watch games with that it was almost reminiscent of Chris Wilder, Sheffield United, with how sort of advanced the centre halves tend to go on either side. So I would like to think that obviously if Iacovitti brings that same sort of forward thrust, he'd be capable of doing that. But I think bringing in sort of a little bit of a creative dynamo in midfield like Ethan Chislett, who can maybe sort of drop into channels as well and help overload on that side and create, I think whoever plays in kind of almost that number 10 role is going to be really, really important as well. And given kind of the signings in midfield that we've made, it does seem as if the makeup of that central 3 is going to be sort of a deeper line 2 and then almost 1 attacking midfielder in behind the 2 forwards. So I think their role when it comes to the overloads and actually creating things, getting balls into the box, I think that's going to be really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what? I'm not quite as sold on the midfield additions as maybe other people might be. Yeah, I think Ethan Chislett's a good League Two player. I think he's a good technician who can pull off some really strong individual moments with that sort of subtlety of touch and the technique that he's able to deliver. But I also feel I have certain concerns about other areas of his game in terms of stepping up to the demands of League One, and then also whether Jason Lowe, in terms of, I suppose there's a world in which if you've got overlapping centre backs, maybe he might be able to provide some solidity in terms of maybe covering some of those runs, possibly, and dropping into defence at times. So are we looking at that sort of plan for Jason Lowe?
I would imagine so, yeah. I think certainly he'll be filling in at sort of in the right back position where required, and I think he will be sort of that covering midfielder who will just sort of sit and clean things up as we sort of have the centre halves going forward. But also, I mean, I'm not entirely sure whether this is something that Crosby does envision, or whether the likelihood is that he will be covering in midfield and in the right back area. But given the departure of Will Forrester, there is some speculation that he might fill in at right centre half sometimes. Um, Whether he'd be effective in that role, I'm not entirely sure, because I've seen little bits of him at Salford, but in terms of how he goes forward, I can't say that I've seen enough to kind of judge how good the attacking side of his game is. And I think a lot of the way that we play will revolve around having sort of two ball playing centre halves either side of perhaps an Nathan Smith, who are going to be looking to carry the ball out of defence, sort of create movement ahead of them, and then look to sort of pick passes going forward.
Yeah, I would have maybe some reservations about Jason Lowe as a right centre back, because I think that he's going to get into 1v1 duels. That's the key sort of necessity for a right centre back in a back three, and you've got to be quick and strong. Maybe you might be able to do the odd job in there, but I think against quick attackers, I'd be a little bit concerned. But we'll see. Listen, hopefully he can do well. How do you feel the squad's coming together generally then, Scott?
Yeah, I think it's looking good, certainly in terms of the back line. I think there might be sort of one more addition in midfield, depending on whether there's another outgoing, because there's a lot of speculation over Tom Conlon's future at the moment. So that could mean that there's a vacancy in midfield, and perhaps we could bring somebody in there to kind of shore things up a little bit more. The key thing that's lacking at the minute is obviously the forward line, because we've only got Ellis Harrison on the books as a senior classic centre forward, let's say. So we probably need to sign sort of two or three in that position. Ideally, another forward with some presence who can sort of replace Harrison, because he was in and out of the side with calf injuries last season. And then we probably want sort of maybe more diminutive strikers who can sort of maybe drop off a little bit into the 10, maybe run the channels, but also kind of be that fox in the box as well, that are going to profiteer from the big man sort of knocking down balls and the chances that will create.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense. What is this season looking like for Ellis Harrison, Scott? Because he's obviously going to start pre-season as the only out-and-out striker, as you mentioned, but he's a bit of a Darrell Clarke's man. He was someone who Darrell Clarke won back-to-back promotions with Darrell Clarke at Bristol Rovers. And then I think Darrell Clarke might have had him at one or two other clubs, possibly, but certainly two clubs. So it just makes me wonder, is Ellis Harrison necessarily going to be the sort of the one that Andy Crosby wants, or what is this season looking like for him, do you think?
Yeah, I think he's certainly part of the camp and part of the dynamic, and I think he's wanted by the manager for sure, because he was our leading goal scorer last season, a very, very dependable player. And like I say, I mean, his commitment was second to none, even when Darrell Clarke had left as well. I mean, he did pick up an injury for the last couple of games, unfortunately, but essentially worked his socks off against Bristol Rovers, got a really, really good goal, and that sort of set us on the way to winning the game and ultimately securing safety as well. So I don't think there's any question in his commitment. Whether I see him at the club beyond this season, that's a whole different question entirely, because with Clarke having gone and him essentially making very clear when he arrived at Port Vale that I'm here to play for the manager, whether obviously he'll feel that his future's elsewhere once he sees out his contract, I think that's probably a different sort of discussion. But I think for this season, I think he'll see out his contract and certainly show his commitment to the club with minimum fuss.
Yeah, well, hopefully he can do that. I want to talk to you about James Plant, Scott, because it doesn't seem to me as though Port Vale have been able to bring through players at will exactly, and that's not a criticism of Vale, because I think lots of clubs have struggled with that. But Plant is one who has come through the academy. He's obviously a winger by trade, but in that game that we referenced earlier at Ipswich, in Andy Crosby's first game in caretaker charge, he was apparently brilliant and did a real good job in central midfield. So do you think he's, even though it's 3-5-2, so it's a formation that doesn't incorporate wingers, orthodox wingers, is there a chance that he can play his way into Andy Crosby's thinking?
Certainly so, especially when you think that we've played obviously a 3-5-2 for the last couple of seasons, and then we've also had places for game changers like Dennis Politic. So I think that certainly as a game-changing player, there's a place for him. I think he was brilliant, not just in that Ipswich game, but also in the games at Charlton and the home game against Plymouth as well. Scored in both of those games, put in some really, really impressive performances, and particularly in that Plymouth game, he took his goal really, really well early on. So I think in terms of the pace and creativity that he brings, there's definitely a future for him here. He'll be a game changer from the bench, I think, looking at the way the squads are sort of shaping up when we do have to kind of tweak things and chase games potentially. But as well as that, I think there could even be a place for him to sort of slot into the centre midfield where needed, or even perhaps play as an auxiliary striker if, we are a little bit short up top. And we know from how the last couple of seasons have been that injuries always tend to bite us, certainly in the final third. So there might well be a point where, we have to essentially throw him in there and we might have to depend on him.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think you'll depend on Funzo OJ this season?
I think he's certainly going to be maybe a starting midfielder for the first few games, but I think a lot of that will depend on sort of how Tom Sang breaks through. Because for me, it seems that it'll be one or the other playing sort of in that slightly deeper role alongside Ben Garrity, and then potentially Ethan Chislett ahead of them. But I think it depends initially on kind of the form that all of them show, because it could well be the case that Ojo and Sang work really, really well as a deep line pair, and then Garrity might be a little bit more effective further forward if the likes of Chislett are finding it different to adapt to the level. So I think a lot of it is going to be who steps up to the plate first and foremost, and how we can kind of balance that midfield to essentially create the most chances, but also ensure that solidity in front of that defensive three. Because if obviously, as we've talked about already, we're going to be giving those wing backs and those centre halves that free rein to go forward, those midfielders are going to have to be very tactically astute and very secure in the defensive role that they've got.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How many players do you think Vale are away from having a squad of players that's good to go for the season then, Scott?
Yeah, well, presuming that the young players, James Plant and Tommy McDermott, don't go out on loan at any point in the campaign, we've got 18 first-team players at the moment, and I think...
I reckon McDermott might go out on loan, possibly.
Yeah, quite possibly. He hasn't seemed to, even though he had a run of games early on last season, he hasn't really kicked on in the same way as James Plant has, and he doesn't seem to kind of have the same physicality about him either. So he could be one that goes out on loan, perhaps to League Two or the National League. That's certainly the sort of level that I'd be looking at for a player of that nature. I think it's probably a waste of time. I think if you're sort of looking at loaning him out even lower down the ladder. But say, for instance, he goes, say, for instance, he stays. I mean, we're probably looking at about 4 or 5 more players, because Crosby has made it clear that he's after a squad of around about 22. So I think we're probably 3 strikers and then maybe a midfielder and possibly 1 more centre half away from the completed puzzle, as it were. There are obviously a lot of rumours going around as to who those players might be, but we'll just have to kind of wait and see what happens on that.
We will, yeah. I suppose if you have a squad of 22, that obviously means that if you get a couple of injuries in one position, you're going to have to dip into the academy. So I do wonder, Scott, what sort of position the club's academy is in at the moment, and maybe the quality of the crop that you've got at the moment. Are there any individual players that have kind of caught your eye there from there at the moment?
Yeah, so there are a few coming through the system that look quite promising. I would say that probably, obviously, Plant and McDermott are the main 2, but there's one fullback called Ben Lomax, I think, who's obviously looks quite solid. So that's one that can potentially fill in. There are also 1 or 2 in midfield, the likes of Bailey DePepper and Dan Mahaffey as well, that might well sort of step into the plate in a training with the first team at the moment. But I think to try and kind of mitigate the likelihood of having to dip into the academy for potential cover for injuries, I think what's been quite clear from the summer recruitment so far is that they're going for versatile options. So Jason Lowe, for instance, can play 2 or 3 positions. Mitch Grant's capable of filling in either side. Connor Grant can fill in midfield or at left wing back. We've also got... who was I going to mention now? Tom Sang, who can play midfield and right wing back as well. So I think there's a lot of mix and match potential there, just to try and obviously cover. And then I suppose if it does kind of get to desperation stations, that's probably when you'd be looking to call upon the younger players.
Yeah, for sure. So I've got to make my 1 to 24 predictions in a few weeks, Scott. What would be the reason for me to be really positive about Port Vale and say, yeah, they could kick on and possibly finish mid-table?
Yeah, I can't argue at the moment that we'll solve the goal scoring problem because we've only got 1 striker. But I think certainly from the recruitment that we've made this summer so far, I don't think we'll be conceding as many goals this season. So I think there'll be plenty of games where we ship maybe just 1 goal a game, or maybe keep a few clean sheets. So I'd hazard a guess, an optimistic guess, that we'll finish top half, maybe sort of 11th, 12th, with a good season. But I think a lot of that's going to depend on sort of who we bring in to try and obviously supplement the final third, because scoring enough goals to actually go and win games rather than just draw our way to safety is going to be really important if we're going to really push up the table this year.
Top half sounds like you're very confident then, Scott. What are the reasons why you're feeling like you could finish top half?
I get the feeling that we're essentially kind of changing the way that we go about games. So I think there was a lot of focus on trying to be a ball playing side last season, even though we were playing on a very, very difficult surface at home. I think with the pitch being sorted now, I think we'll be able to play football, but we know for a fact that opposition sides who are higher in the league probably have better technical players than we do, are also going to be able to play football more on that surface as well. So there's a lot more of an emphasis of being solid at the back, having a presence at the back, having a presence from set piece situations and nicking more goals that way. And I think with the set piece quality that players such as Chislett and Grant will bring to the table, the height of the likes of Jakovic and Smith in there, but also the threat of Dan Jones' long throws as well, potentially to add into the mix. I think there could be a lot more of a set piece threat this year. So I think with that sort of solid base and then trying to just sort of nick goals and sort of win games that way, I think that'll make us a little bit of a tougher nut to crack this year.
Yeah, well, let's hope that's the case, and obviously the club will need to add quality and attack on top of that. But yeah, hopefully they can tighten up certainly, because and the additions look like they've done that. On the flip side of that, then, Scott, what would be the reason for me to be a bit cautious about Port Vale and say this could be a dogfight?
It's whether we can score enough goals, because it's all well and good, of course, being able to say, oh, we'll concede no more than 1 goal a game, but we actually have to score in that instance. So if, for instance, it isn't particularly clicking on the creative side of things, we could find ourselves losing a lot of games by the odd goal, and that could very well, like I say, with a winless run of about 5 or 6 games, sort of drag us into a little bit of a dogfight down the bottom. So I think a lot of it is going to depend on, right, so we've signed a few sort of creative players, we've signed a lot of quality in terms of deliveries and set pieces, but who's actually going to be on the end of it, who's going to be scoring the goals? So that sort of final piece of the puzzle is where, we really, really need to get that right. And my cautious optimism on that side of things is we've obviously landed what sounds like quite a sizable fee for the Will Forrester transfer to Bolton. So if we reinvest that wisely enough, we could actually bring in that quality striker that's going to be that final piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, let's hope you can do that. How far do you think, you mentioned the Will Forrester money, and hopefully the club can do a lot with that on and off the pitch. How far do you think the club is off what the Shanahan described as their target of becoming a championship ready football club?
I think you've got to look at it as being something that's a target for the next sort of 4 or 5 years. I don't think we're going to be getting there anytime soon, because I suppose what is quite clear is we're making money off players, which is great. We're making sellable assets, and we're able to sort of bring in some better quality at League One now. But if we are going to be sort of in the business of selling a player every year or something along those lines, a lot of people have mixed opinions on sort of how crucial Will Forrester was in the team, but it is only going to be so long until they're coming for your prized assets and they're coming for your more creative players. So I think it is going to be sort of 3 to 5 years of potentially having to kind of reset parts of the squad every summer, sort of reinvest wisely, sort of bolster the quality, and then just land on that one season where, we've got the formula right and we can have maybe a realistic crack at that top 6. So my rough guess would probably be around about sort of 3 to 5 years minimum, but possibly maybe the next sort of 8 to 10.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. Well, hopefully the club can continue that positive trajectory after the slight disruption with what happened with Darrell Clarke. But listen, Scott, it's been such a pleasure to chat Vale with you. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thanks to you for watching at home. This has been EFL Debate, the Port Vale Summer Deep Dive with Scott Challinor, and we'll see you again very soon.
Cheers, guys. Appreciate it.